familiar with his story from talking to SAS people and reading the article in the September issue of the SAS newsletter. I'll let Dave then introduce his crew and turn it over to you, Dave.
Okay, thank you, Mark, and please accept my apologies. Making assumptions is dangerous business, and I assumed Atlantic was Eastern, and I was wrong. So I apologize profoundly for that. This is not how I had planned things to start. But I would like to screen share, and basically what I thought might work is we have about 30 slides, and there is about 20 seconds of narration for each of those 30 slides. If we were to run through them, I think we would burn out everybody's circuits. There's just too much information. So what I thought I would do is put the slides up one at a time and then pause for conversation or questions. I see that 2 of my students have joined already, and since I gave them the wrong time, I hope the other one will join us soon. Jenifer Fidela is one of those students, and there's Jenifer, just came on, and Yabsira Ayele. Both of these are international students who are at Berea College and in the course that I was teaching. There really are 2 parts to this presentation. One is the research itself. And this was not a large study with thousands of people that you would normally use for any kind of model building. It was based on a sample of 120 people at Berea College. It was in service of a course in industrial organizational psychology, which had enrolled about 25 or 30 students altogether. And we were very interested and concerned about the apparent tension between the promises of academic freedom, of speaking your mind, and the Title IX restriction that thou shalt not create a hostile environment, with a hostile environment being defined as any situation that makes somebody uncomfortable. And as I'm sure you know, as advocates of free speech, free speech is not needed unless it does make somebody uncomfortable, because speech that makes nobody uncomfortable obviously needs no protection. So with that, I'm going to attempt to screen share, run a slide with the narration, pause, and if anybody wants to speak up, what I would invite you to do is simply unmute yourself and say your piece. And especially Jen and Yabsira have seen this research and may have other comments they would like to add. Does that make sense to everybody? Does anybody object to that? I guess I should say. Okay, without further ado, then let me share my screen. How distortions, discontinuities, and dissonance thwart cancel culture.
You're not sharing.
Yeah, are you having trouble? There should be a button at the bottom, share screen. If
Okay,
you don't have it, I will make you the host and you can maybe try again. You're now the host, which also means you'll get all the questions. So please do not send Dave the questions if you have any. Send them directly to me.
Okay, just a second.
Could be you got to click it twice, right? You got to click share screen and then you got to do it again.
Yeah, you have to share a screen and then choose the program that you want to share.
How about that?
Very good.
That's working? Okay. How distortions, discontinuities, and dissonance thwart cancel culture's promises. Okay, this was our introduction, and obviously reference to the biblical flies in the ointment, the notion that a few small things can make good intentions go wrong. Any questions? Goals of diversity and inclusion. However, our survey study revealed many ways in which local cancel culture's characteristic beliefs and actions make it unlikely its lofty goals will be realized. So we, I think, as a group, the 4 students and I wanted to be clear that we're not against diversity and inclusion. It's the means to the end that was causing the problem and the real dangers in this.
Can you define cancel culture for this engineer?
Yes. I think cancel culture can be defined primarily by its intent to eliminate a person who has gone against the norms of the overall group. Norms is expressed in Title IX of not creating any kind of uncomfortable environment. So it may vary from students who are willing to use their voice to shout down a speaker that they think might be objectionable. Some students might even resort to some kind of delinquency or violence to prevent that, to efforts by an administration to censure or silence somebody who's speaking against their program. So cancel culture, the idea of cancellation, is a person has something to say, and not only do we engage that person and argue against the argument, we try and cancel the individual in an ad hominem way. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it seems to be consistent with what I read in The Economist recently.
Yeah, it's pretty nasty stuff.
Yeah.
It's promised a more diverse, inclusive, and stable society. However, due to fundamental flaws and inconsistencies in postmodernism, critical theories, intersectionality, and neo-socialism, cancel culture is unlikely to actually create these idyllic societies. We have questions. I suspect many of you recognize some of these people. I think their intentions were not bad. However, when those intentions and theories get translated into particular policies, sometimes it created real difficulties for institutions. Colleges adopted cancel culture's woke-utopian perspective. Guidance from the Office of Civil Rights was often amplified as it was integrated into the rhetoric of college policies and programs. Administrators promised that the protection from hostile working and learning environments would extend academic freedom. However, there is an inherent tension between the exercise of academic freedom and prohibiting language that might be subjectively offensive. These are all drawn from the Berea College faculty manual. And I'd like to draw your attention just briefly to the one in the lower left corner, harassment policy commentary, where the claim is actually made that in prohibiting harassment in all its forms, Berea seeks to preserve and enhance academic freedom for all members of the campus community. So the notion here is if we allow or if we prohibit harassment, words that might offend, that somehow we're extending freedom. And this is characteristic, I think, of some of the double speak and double talk that comes forth in the associated with wokeness. Other comments?
Yeah, I have a question. Just actually, I wanted to ask you a question about your previous slide, but I couldn't find my hand thing quick enough.
Oh, good.
I'm just wondering why you assume that these proponents of this have good intentions.
That's an excellent question.
Because I've seen some obvious not in good intentions about what's happening.
Yeah, and I would have to say my last 3 years of experience have shifted me away from that belief.
And
However,
I just wanted to just raise a point with you, which is it's a struggle for probably power and resources. That is part of it.
Yes.
So people
Yes.
are trying to gain access to university resources, and this kind of approach that they're taking make them much more effective in being able to divert these scarce resources, which should be devoted to scientific inquiry, philosophical inquiries, the search for the truth, are getting diverted into these activist kind of networks.
And I guess just a brief answer to your question, and then we'll move to Dr. Sullivan. I think in terms of organizations, it is an advantage to think the best and let a few people disappoint you than to think the worst and let a few people pleasantly surprise you. And so I think that is probably a bias on my part, but once people show you who they are and what they're up to, I think then some of these good intentions evaporate, and even the facade of, or the claim to good intentions, disappear.
I just wanted to say my own view is assuming the good intentions is making us less effective to fight it. If we came out more strongly in terms of opposing what is called rent seeking and power dynamics, and did this, and like it just puts us a little bit at a disadvantage to assume people have good intentions.
Yeah, I'm not sure that I could make a strong argument against that. I think each organization may be somewhat different and needs to be decided, but there certainly are many instances I know of, and in my own case, had I been more forceful earlier. And Pedro Dominguez, said, never apologize. And my inclination when I saw my students being attacked, being spit at and pushed, and an administration that wasn't doing anything, I offered an apology and I took the blame. And in retrospect, that was probably a mistake. So, Dr. Sullivan?
Phil, it's Phil. Is this
Yes.
related to the microaggression issue? Recently, the Ontario Human Rights Commission told universities that they have to come up with a microaggression policy, which was itself the depth of absurdity. But is it related to this?
Oh, yes, I think so. And microaggressions are, just an interesting oxymoron. They sometimes are defined as having no intent, but simply words or action that offend. And the idea that someone might be punished for words or actions that were unintended, certainly not intended to be offensive, to me is just absurd. As a psychologist and a behavioral scientist, the use of punishment when you have very ill-defined and unclear rules is extraordinarily problematic, but it is ironically the first choice of those who are least capable of applying any kind of behavioral consequence. So yes, it's very closely tied to the notion of microaggressions. And, I think the idea of microaggression itself is not necessarily bad, but the solution to microaggressions is conversation and education rather than censure and punishment. Janae, welcome. This is one of my other students. Do you have words?
Yes, I just want to, really want you to clarify whether or not we are saying that microaggressions aren't based in people's reality. I think, are you saying that the microaggressions, the way that people approach handling them is wrong? Or are you saying the concept of microaggressions all in all is just incorrect?
Yeah, I think what I was saying is the way we handle them, the consequences are incorrect. There are microaggressions and people are going to disagree. There are different people from different cultures who have sensitivities. And it really is an obligation of those in positions of authority and responsibility to ensure that their voices get heard. And microaggressions can be a vehicle, a way to start to address these problems. However, when microaggressions automatically lead to sanctions without understanding what the intentions were and without clear communication and conversation on both sides, that's when I think they become very problematic. Janae, what do you think?
I think that when it comes to something like microaggressions, it's hard to try to come up with the intent. You can't measure the intent of when somebody does a microaggressive act against another person. How do you propose that that's gonna be addressed?
Yeah, I think asking them is a start. And I think also telling them why we think it might be a microaggression. What is the harm that's been caused? How did the offense come about? Not in a sense for them to argue against that, but for them to try and understand. I think conversations about microaggressions take place best in relationships that are already established. People care about each other and want to communicate. Once those things are broken, if microaggressions themselves get weaponized, I think everybody suffers as a consequence of that. Back to you, Janae.
I think it's definitely a highly volatile subject, and it depends on your identity, right? So
I think it's influenced by your identity.
yeah,
I wouldn't say that's the only thing, because I think the relationship is really profoundly important.
mhm,
Okay, shall we move on?
yes.
Dr. Christina.
Yes, distortions. They're not quite long. Yes, Christina?
I'm not 100% sure if that fits in here, but I just throw it in. When we're talking about microaggressions, usually we are talking about something that is done either intentionally or unintentionally to harm somebody else. What I'm hearing from my students, and my students are about 85% students of color, mostly from India, Pakistan, places like that. What I'm hearing from them is that they are really offended by anything that runs under the banner of affirmative action. So anything that has the idea that they need a leg up, that we shouldn't be as hard on them as we're on white students and all this kind of stuff. So they find that deeply offensive. Does that count as a microaggression? Does that count somewhere else?
I'm not sure. I know one of the things that I regularly put in my syllabus is that lowering expectations is the most profound form of disrespect.
Exactly, yeah.
Students at Berea College, and actually lots of students, resonate very strongly and very positively with that. And the idea that somehow we're going to lower standards to allow certain people to appear to succeed when they really aren't, I think is very problematic. Yabsira.
Yeah, I think all these questions really relate to intent, and really what Dave said earlier about thinking the best in people or having the best intentions. And ultimately microaggressions and the challenges that they're posed come from having not the best of intentions for actions. Like, for example, when a student, Dr. Christina, if a student were to unnecessarily challenge your intellect on your class, where they would, whatever field of study that you study, if they just challenge you because they didn't trust you, technically that would be understood as a microaggression. However, the way that you take that intent, right? When a student challenges you, do you assert your capacity and then let them earn your respect, or do you find it offensive and then do you report them to the dean or whatever and get them expelled or whatever that might be? So it's really important to recognize and assume the best of intentions. When a student's challenging you, are they challenging you because you're inept, or are they challenging you because they themselves are uncomfortable? And having that best intention really alleviates the issues that are there with the microaggressions. So, microaggressions are there, right? Like somebody being labeled inadequate because they're Indian and, like they think they're not capable, or a person who's white who might be expected one way or the other. Those microaggressions exist. And the challenge comes when we have people with bad intentions undermining the experiences instead of trying to understand. And that's where we can really get into. And that's why, I really appreciated Dave and Dr. Porter's mindset around, having the best of intentions when he had microaggressions against him. And maybe that was for the bad because of the consequences he had. But ultimately having that really alleviates that. And that's where we really want to go towards.
Thank you.
Thank you, Yabsira. Francis, are we back to you?
It seems to me from this conversation is that there is no way to objectively determine a microaggression.
I think it's awfully hard to define objectively, and that's why I think a conversation is an appropriate response because it allows education and searching for commonality, common ground, and common meaning. And punishment, I think, almost always is going to be counterproductive. Henry?
Yes, I guess I just wanted to maybe just echo that in the sense that we have laws. If you break the law, you can go to court, you can do, if you go and you slander somebody, you can raise questions about it. If something violence happens, then it's against the law. What I don't understand is if we're going to start having something called microaggressions, which every time I hear discussions about it, somebody else, whoever's talking about it, defines it differently. I think we have laws, and I think if you think that some microaggression is very bad and there should be a law about it, then there are procedures for doing that, for changing the law, so that microaggression is against the law. But it should not be the university's job to police free speech and to decide these type of situations. That's my opinion, but or a question, I don't know.
Yes, I think, I taught at the Air Force Academy for some time, and the cadets had a number of sayings that I found particularly frustrating. And one of them is if the minimum weren't good enough, it wouldn't be the minimum. Or another one is if you wait till the last minute, it only takes a minute. The idea that we can get by and achieve what we're capable of if everybody only does the minimum, the things that we have laws that if you break them, you can be punished for, I think leads to certainly suboptimal classroom dynamics, suboptimal organizations. I think there are things that we can learn from conversations involving microaggressions. And, you know, I'm not in favor of banning critical race theory. I'm not a fan of it. I'm certainly not in favor of banning the notion or the word microaggression. I think there's a lot that we all can learn from it if we engage it appropriately and don't threaten to punish, cancel, or otherwise harm people who get involved. Gail.
So also, I think that they might come often from misunderstandings. Some cultures, for example, if you look someone in the eye when you're talking to them, that's a sign of disrespect. In North America, we like to look people in the eye when we're talking to them. People need to respect each other enough to be able to say, I think what you did hurts me. This is why I think it hurts me. And then let the other person say, oh, I didn't understand. I didn't mean to hurt you. I didn't know. Or, you know, explain why it wasn't hurtful. Like if it was in North America, you'd say, gee, it's a sign of respect looking you in the eye. You know, and come to terms. But I mean, punishment for misunderstanding is not appropriate.
Right. Janae.
I think it comes back around to intent. If I feel as though what you've said to me is blatantly racist and your intent was to be racist, I don't think it's, you know, a lot of people don't feel like it's their responsibility to have to say to you, hey, you hurt my feelings, because it's wrong in their eyes for you to say something like, you know, oh, I'm surprised that you could speak so eloquently, because the expectation is that I can't speak eloquently. I've been in personal situations where that was intended to demean me. And so I think that a lot of people are just fed up with the excuses. And so people are generally getting tired of people using the excuse of, oh, I just didn't know, because a lot of times they do know exactly what they're doing. So it comes down to intent. Some people don't know what they're doing. Some people do know exactly what they're doing with the racist things that they say.
I think that's correct. And I know from our conversations, yours and mine, you have personal experiences with those things. I think that to move on with the presentation, we'll hear from Phil if he likes. But all of this is that we live in a world that we try and extract information from, and it's never enough. It's kind of the Carl Sagan notion that we're in a large dark cave and all we have is this tiny candle, and it's, you know, there are lots of things that are inadequate, and you could take the candle to mean our consciousness or our awareness, and there are some things we know and some things we do, and some of them are wrong, but there's a whole lot of ignorance and things we don't know, and we can blame the candle for being inadequate, but the last thing in the world we want to do is blow it out. You know, we need our own perceptions and we need the perceptions of others, and we need to be able to enter into conversations so we can all get better at what we do. And I think that's the goal. And really that's the goal of cognitive behavioral therapy. We have a slide here by Aaron Beck talking about distortions. And in some ways, microaggressions, because of the confusion and misunderstanding, are a source of real distortions where people share an experience but have exactly the opposite recollections or impressions of what happened. Janae, do you have something else? Move on then.
I'm good for now.
Okay. Well, particular life lies or distortions named by Lukyanov and Haydn as the origin of the negative consequences that have occurred with the awakening of organizations to a new but largely inaccurate understanding of how the world works. I would, for those of you who may not have read Coddling of the American Mind by Lukyanov and Haidt, it's an excellent book and basically states that the distortions, the misconceptions that we have, the three things listed on the left, have contributed to the misuse and abuse of the things that are on the right. Yes, Francis.
So why is this being attributed to socialism? I understand the postmodernist kind of angle, but I've always kind of been slightly confused about how this is linked to socialism.
I think in very broad general terms, the idea that the state can intrude and control all activities is a socialist notion, the level and amount of control. And so it's not trigger warnings or microaggressions or safe zones themselves, but when they get turned into rules and regulations and imposed on people, I think many would see that as socialist in character. Christina?
Well, having spent most of my life in socialism, I can tell you that's not quite it. But the reason I had raised my hand was to address something that Jenny, is that correct? Brought up. The perception that when somebody, for instance, says, oh, you speak really eloquently, that presupposes that they don't expect that to come from you. As someone who has moved to Canada and speaks with a very strong accent, I get this a lot. Your English is really great. And sometimes it's tempting especially if it comes from people that are kind of like above me in the hierarchy, to take that as, well, I didn't really expect that from you because you're a foreigner. The thing is, I spent a lot of time in Nova Scotia and I learned that in most cases, it was actually a compliment. People are genuinely surprised. A lot of Canadians just speak one language. So if you speak a second language, they already admire you. So you have power there. You can decide how you want to take those kind of things. You don't have to let it get down on you, regardless of what the intentions are. If the person who said it was really an asshole, bad on them. If they actually really meant to compliment you, then it's even better for you. So it is not
there was a national survey about this notion of complimenting somebody for their English being better than expected. And something like 85–90% of the people who were surveyed, a cross section of the population, really saw it as a compliment. And so, it's hard to have clear rules because individuals differ from each other. And yeah, I suspect my characterization of socialism was a little clipped and a little brief, but I think many people use that as just the notion that the state or the organization can have more rather than less control. Janae.
I completely understand what Christina is saying. That is a experience that is what a lot of foreigners experience. But if I was born and raised in America and I've spoken English all my life, and you're judging me based off the fact that you assume that African Americans are ignorant, and because I get to speak, that's a, you know, it's a different kind of experience. And it does depend on the situation. I've had that said to me in a negative way. And I think that, you know, as individuals, we have our own life experiences and things like that. And so, you know, it's kind of hard to get other people to understand where I'm coming from if I've had my own unique experiences. But oddly enough, when I've spoken to a lot of other African Americans about this is an experience that we share, being told by, you know, a person who is in a dominant position, oh, you know how to speak well. And I'm not a foreigner. I didn't have to learn how to speak English. I've been here all my life. They're surprised that I, you know, have an education. And, you know, and so it definitely depends on the context.
Yeah, I think often what we hear is not what people intend, and in other times they don't know what they intend by what their own words say. And so more communication, I think, is a solution that's helpful.
Just a fun fact, when I travel now back to Germany, quite often I get something from people, oh, your German is really good. Well, I was born in Germany. I spent my first 28 years of my life in Germany.
Let's see.
And I shut up now.
It's important to note that not all discontinuities are harmful. Distinctions between violations and non-violations, or between activities protected by academic freedom and those that would not be protected, are helpful. On the other hand, discontinuities among and between explicit beliefs, perceptions, and judgments are problematic, but all too often ignored. Okay, so things that are discontinuous can be helpful if there was clearly one category that was a hostile environment and one that was not, and everybody agreed on it. Actually, another professor at Berea College did some study on torture, and what he found about torture is almost the same thing that we found about hostile environments, and that was a bell curve. You know, there are, when you look at real instances, an awful lot of cases that end up right in the muddy middle. On the other hand, discontinuities between explicit narratives, the words we use, and the choices that we make, the patterns in behavior, can be very problematic because you know, you don't know whether to argue with the person's words, explicit words, or what's implied by the actions and the choices that they've made. Discontinuities between our words and actions is the way we humans process information. We are not only dual channel information processors. Over the last 40 years, cognitive scientists have discovered that we are multi-channel processors, and our control or even awareness of many of these processing activities is quite limited. Aware of such discontinuities, their presence is likely to lead to dissonance, often the cause of internal discomfort and great distress. Can occur within organizations as well as within individuals. Organizational justice is comprised of several equally important components, seeking to enforce distributive justice by adjusting procedures to favor certain groups while punishing others, and ignoring the need for transparency and institutional integrity is likely to have dire consequences for any college or university, as well as the individuals who become cancel culture's targets. So these were the conversations that we had had in the IO course that made the survey seem like such a good idea, to find out where the campus community was in talking and thinking about all of these things. Often the language divides and confuses us, and yet it's what we have to use to try to work our way through and work our way out of these things. Or how they occur, dissonances create distress and require resolution, either by taking action to change the situation or altering perceptions or values. Unfortunately, adjusting perceptions and asserting separate realities are often easier than actually fixing the system. And I think all of us involved in education sometimes need to remind ourselves and one another that we're here to seek the truth, that will look for the truth, and our bona fide good faith efforts to seek the truth really has to be the entry into any conversation. And unfortunately, the more political these conversations become, the less willing people are to learn something and to ask questions and let the truth emerge rather than to assert it. A little confused by all this, you haven't been listening. Unfortunately, the number of studies that rely on evidence rather than rhetorical arguments is limited. The number and type of relevant variables and potential ways to measure them is unclear. However, applying the principles and processes of psychological science is a place to start to reduce the confusion, clarify the issues, and understand the challenges we face. So the general pedagogical strategy in this course was to invite an increased awareness of discomfort of the way these things, including identity and beliefs and politics, perceptions and judgments, how they might all fit together. And would it be possible to conduct a survey to gather information and put them together in a way that might be useful and informative, rather than to proselytize or to basically put forward a particular view or indoctrinate, simply to seek information and evidence that might be put together in a way that would be informative and helpful. Out of a local effort to begin this work, as Lee McIntyre suggests, the most important thing about science is not the method, but an attitude that encourages us to respect as well as collect empirical evidence and be willing to adjust our theories accordingly. Our study was a classroom activity designed to collect evidence relevant to the challenges students were experiencing on campus. It sought local and specific information about the dynamics of these issues at Berea College rather than generalizable knowledge. I'd have to say that one of the things that surprised me the most was how aware students in the class were of these issues and the problems that were caused. So I'd like to ask, I don't know if Jen, Yabsira, or Janae would like to comment on that. From what we've covered so far and the notions of academic freedom and hostile environments, what had you experienced prior to this class, or had you had any kind of classroom discussion or anybody address these issues?
Are you asking like when has?
Yes.
No, like I don't
Bill,
think
go ahead.
the issues of academic freedom and hostile environments, they
Right.
weren't they weren't addressed.
Yeah, but were you familiar with the tensions in there?
Yes.
I have the same answer as Jenny.
Say again, Jen?
I have the same answer as Jenny.
Okay, had you experienced, any kind of oppression where you didn't speak up in class because the teacher had a particular answer that expected?
Yes, I'm sorry. That was a thunder for that one. But yeah, I think what people doesn't actually realize is how much it's hurting the student too. There's a lot of times I have an opinion that I don't want to speak up about because I know that if I say it, it's probably going to impact my grade or like how the instructor view me, or it's going to be like a big thing tomorrow with like my peers. I think it's an evidence that after your survey came out, the social media was going crazy and like Facebook was going crazy, and all of the students that are in the study are getting backlashes, and that's why I think it's really hurting the quality of education for the students, because when you say something that you think other people are gonna disagree on, you're thinking about, oh my God, am I gonna get kicked out of school for saying this? And I'm an international student. That means if I get kicked out, I'm done. It's deportation time. It's like I'm going back, and it takes a lot of hard work for me to just get here. So, and then at the end of the day, I'm weighing, do I wanna like speak my mind, or do I wanna jeopardize my place here that I've worked so hard for?
Thank you.
I misinterpreted your
Types
question.
of variables were examined. 3 dichotomous demographic variables measured identity. Responses to direct questions about belief reflected respondents' explicit knowledge. Measuring implicit knowledge required an indirect approach. 20 hypothetical but realistic and ecologically valid scenarios asked about respondents' perceptions of hostile environments and judgments about academic freedom protection. Responses to these questions measured implicit knowledge.
So the 9 things in bold face: race, gender, sexual orientation, political identity, activism, hostile environment protection. Each of those was a variable that was going to be included in the survey.
The descriptive statistics. Demographic data were comparable to a previous survey conducted on the Berea campus by the University of Pennsylvania. Political identification showed a liberal bias. There was strong explicit support for the First Amendment, and our 3 indexes appeared to be reliable, as shown by the high Cronbach's alphas.
So Cronbach's alpha is just a measure of how tightly the components or the items that are included in a variable are grouped together. And 0.8 is 0.80 would be assumed to be adequate. All of these are very close to 0.90, which is very good, saying that the responses to a variety of items, 13 items or 15 items in the academic freedom, all clustered together very closely. Knowing how people answered some of those would tell you how they answered the others.
More notes from our inspection of the initial results. Respondents explicitly claimed to support both the First Amendment and protection from hostile learning and work environments. Berea College appeared to be slightly less activist oriented than the students in Villaseñor's 2017 survey. However, the fact that a greater proportion of Berea College students reported self-censoring than in his national survey was a cause for concern.
Yes, Francis.
I just wanted to ask a question about the previous slide and the identifiers, the political identification.
Yes.
Was that something that was asked of people? How do you identify? Do you identify very conservative, conservative, liberal, very liberal? Was that
Yes.
you gave them the choices of those 5? Is that right?
Yes. And I think 16% preferred not to answer. I should also note, in terms of doing a survey, you don't want to prime people to those identity questions. And so they went through the entire survey first and then answered those at the end. So they weren't saying, oh, well, I'm a liberal, so I should answer it this way or that way. They went through the scenarios and the beliefs first and then answered the identity questions at the end.
So did you have a none of the above?
Yes. Well, I prefer not to answer.
Prefer not to answer. Because
Yeah.
it's possible someone might have identified as something else,
Right.
but there wasn't a category that they would.
Right. And the ones we used were from a survey by John Villaseñor, 2017, of 1,500 students, and that has been used elsewhere as well. There certainly are exceptions to that and people who might have answered otherwise.
Analyses was a simple scattergram of the ratings of the scenarios as being hostile environment violations and whether the activists that created them would be protected by academic freedom. There were no apparent beneficial discontinuities in either of these index variables. The ratings of hypothetical scenarios appeared to be continuous, with about a third of the average ratings for both measures falling between slightly agree and slightly disagree. This level of uncertainty and ambiguity makes training and effective use of punishment very problematic.
So one of the questions that's raised about the wisdom or the ethics of this survey is that we used actual events as the basis for the scenarios we created. We made no claims as to whether they were true or not, and we sometimes modified the race and gender of the individuals involved. We didn't reveal any names, but I think the sample of 20 events here was characteristics of things that had gone on at the college for the last 20 years or 15 years that I'd been there. And the one clear thing is that basically, contrary to the claim by the college that hostile environment restrictions were going to increase academic freedom, this was an extraordinarily strong negative correlation, that the events that were seen as being related to a hostile environment were the ones that nobody wanted to grant academic freedom to.
That across the 20 scenarios, there was a strong negative correlation between the two criteria. Scenarios that were judged as being hostile environments were not judged to be protected by academic freedom. Didn't the college claim that introduction of hostile environment protection would support and extend academic freedom?
Obviously, these results did not set well with everyone.
Correlations across respondents. As most behavioral scientists have learned, matters such as these are complicated, and many important variables are interrelated. However, at least as far as the Berea College campus is concerned, racial identity did not appear to be a significant factor. highest correlations. The perception of hostile environments is a key variable. Being female, identifying as a liberal and activist, and an explicit belief in the need for protection all predict increased sensitivity to hostile environments. The single highest correlation is the strong negative relationship between hostile environment sensitivity and academic freedom decisions. Those most sensitive to hostile environments were the least willing to grant academic freedom protection. Once again, the promise of hostile environment protection facilitating academic freedom appears to have been negated. Correlations measure relationships between two variables. However, multiple causation is ubiquitous in the behavioral science. This requires using a more advanced statistical procedure, multiple regression. Nearly a century ago, a junior faculty member at Harvard elaborated on an approach to using modified stepwise multiple regression equations to construct speculative models of relationships among variables.
I'd like to take just a second to brag on some of the graduates of the Berea College psychology program, because we have probably at one point we had 2/3 to 3/4 of the students within 2 years enrolled in graduate programs. And one of the things that we got as feedback regularly, and I think actually Janae and I talked about this previously, is that after 12 semester hours of really pretty rigorous mathematical and statistical preparation, the students that go into graduate work in any of the behavioral sciences tend to do exceptionally well. Let's see, Yabsira completed his master's degree already in a medical management program, and Janae's enrolled at large university in a IO diversity program. Would either of you care to comment on the preparation you had at Berea?
The program that I'm in is industrial organizational psychology. And I think that Berea prepared us very well as far as having us go through rigorous research and statistics courses.
Yabsira, are you there?
Yeah, I would like to concur that. I think there's a lot of experience just outside of the academic field as well, to be able to apply the theories that we're learning in the books. And I think I was very well prepared to apply what I learned outside of the academic field and the academic field.
Yeah, and I think multiple regression is an excellent umbrella to kind of fit together a whole lot of other statistical procedures that students learned. And it's a way of viewing and thinking about problems. And certainly Sewell Wright's notion of path analysis adds an important kind of meaning context to when you're doing these multiple regressions and what are the implications of what we're finding. So in addition to the statistics, we have the theoretical or philosophical underpinning.
Part of the path analytic approach is a hypothetical predictive flow. We used 5 predictive stages to sort the 9 survey variables. For example, we assumed that demographic variables might affect political identity, explicit beliefs, perceptions, and judgments, but that none of these variables would influence a respondent's gender, race, or sexual orientation. What combination of the demographic variables best predicted political identity, gender, sexual orientation, and their interaction were found to predict about 1/3 of the variance in political identity. The bar graph on the right shows that heterosexual males are the outliers of the 4 demographic groups. Heterosexual males were less liberal than any of the other groups.
So the 5 categories are shown here on the left, and these are the different groups. Sexual orientation would be heterosexual on the left and other on the right. Female in what was pink at one point looks a little red now, and then the males in blue. And you can see that for everybody other than heterosexual males, the average was around 4 or moderately liberal, whereas for heterosexual males, the average was in the neutral category. And here are the ends. There were 47 of our sample of 120 who were heterosexual males, 40 who were heterosexual females, and for other, in the males, we had 10. In the females, we had 24. And one of the things you might note is an extraordinarily high proportion of female students who identified as something other than heterosexual. But this was exactly the same proportion that came from the previous year's University of Pennsylvania survey on sexual assault.
So the regression of the 3 explicit beliefs using political identity as a predictor. After political identity was considered, none of the demographic variables were significant. A liberal political view, an endorsement of activism, and explicit support for hostile environment protection all relate positively to one another. This is cognitive consonance. However, when the belief in academic freedom is added, dissonance appears. Subjects who endorse the need for hostile environment protection also endorse the First Amendment. However, a belief in activism was negatively correlated with endorsement of the First Amendment protection. This is cognitive dissonance. The variable was the index . Index of perceptions of hostile environments. 4 variables contributed significantly to explaining over half the variance. Liberal women who endorsed activism and supported the need for hostile environment protection were more likely to perceive scenarios as being hostile environments.
Earlier, we had a conversation about microaggressions, and those are fairly ambiguous compared to the notion of the creation of a hostile environment, which is in fact written into the US law under Title IX, well, actually under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act. So even a law that is on the books and something that can be enforced is influenced by the identity and beliefs of the people viewing or reading about the scenario. In Kahneman's words, his new book, Noise, looks at errors in human judgment. All of these are sources of bias. There should be some objective measure of what a hostile environment is, and yet over half the variance in how it's rated is influenced by things such as people's identity and beliefs, and the variance in those predicts the variance in how they're going to see the situation. So from an organizational standpoint, in terms of enacting discipline or bringing about justice, this really is a mess.
Variable was the index of judgments that activities described in the scenarios would be protected by academic freedom. In this case, the strongest predictor by far was the prior perception of the scenario as being a hostile environment. Respondents who perceived environments to be hostile were less likely to support academic freedom protection. Respondents' explicit assertions that the First Amendment was important also helped predict this judgment index, but only about 1/6 as much as the negative influence of the hostile environment perception, which combines all the previous analyses into a single hypothetical model predicting the index score for judgment of academic freedom protection. From Berea College's Office of Institutional Research and Assessment suggests that the chilling effect of cancel culture has already diminished persistence for some groups of students and diminished overall viewpoint diversity.
And as some of you may be aware, these numbers have gotten even worse more recently, not just at Berea College, but I think across North America, that males are falling out and not completing programs at a much higher rate than females are.
Keep several caveats in mind. This was a mere classroom study to acquaint students with the value of adopting a scientific attitude and measuring variables before arguing about them. It was local and not designed to produce generalizable knowledge. With the Qualtrics anonymous response option, we received about 3 times as many applications for prize drawings as completed surveys. And even asking these questions was very upsetting to some portions of the campus community. The 120 completed surveys provided a representative sample and the opportunity to identify important relationships among these variables. The belief that one should use their voice to suppress the expression of contrary views undermines liberal arts education. The absence of discontinuities in the perceptions and judgments suggests that Title IX training will be difficult. Differences between professed beliefs, perceptions, and judgments are a source of dissonance, both for individuals and institutions. Pretending that such dissonance does not exist compounds the difficulties. If an institution promises to provide academic freedom, this must include protection, even when the words are experienced or expected to be offensive to some members of the community. Has been brought to you by Jenifer Fidela, Janae Davis, Aaron Clark, Yabsira Ayele, and Dave Porter. My students and myself, thank you.
Let me look at the chat and see what questions we have in there. Just a reminder, mute yourself. If you're not currently speaking, please send any questions. Okay, so that's not it. Thanks, Dave, to you and your students. I'm afraid I have to be out of here at 9. Oh, sorry. Thank you. Sure about, can you say anything about this? Do you feel the study can be replicated? I think that's an excellent question. The question here, can you see my screen? Probably not. It says, we hear a lot, and this is from Henry Volkovitz. We hear a lot about in the news and literature about replication for studies. Can you say anything about this? Do you feel your studies can be replicated, should be tried? I think so. And the reason I say this, I have several reasons. One, we did a similar study on the causes in predicting student success. and looking at a number of both cognitive and non-cognitive factors. We did the same study again 4 years later and replicated to kind of a tenth of a point the structure that came out. The structures and the correlations are so strong in some of the cases, I think those are going to replicate. The ones that are borderline or small may have small differences. But basically, I think the survey methodology, the survey took about 30 minutes. The website that I have has the full survey there with the initial results that you can look at, or I'd be glad to send that to you or make it available. I think it would replicate well. And I think would be a very educational experience for campus to look at their own answers and their own population and see, where the numbers come out. So other questions or comments?
I think Boris Kowalski had a question. They typed questions. I think they wanted to speak verbally. So if you're ready, please ask your question.
Okay. Hello, Boris.
You need to unmute, Boris.
All right, thank you. Thank you for that presentation. I read your paper beforehand and I was quite impressed, and I thought I'd really like to dig into this a little bit more carefully and seriously, and you've given me just more incentive to do that with your presentation, so I'm very grateful for that. Two very quick questions. I want to come back to what Francis asked you about earlier, and that is the slide in which you talk about socialism and postmodernism being a source of lies or misrepresentations or something along those lines. I can't remember. I wonder whether it would be useful to make a distinction about socialism. That is to say, the kind of socialism that leads to or goes hand in hand with authoritarianism or totalitarianism on the one hand, and the socialism that is compatible with the basic principles of liberal democracy. And I myself favor making such a distinction because I think it allows for the possibility of a variety of points of view within a liberal democratic form of government, ranging from left social democrats through the middle liberals to the conservatives on the right, as long as what they agree on is the basic principles of liberal democracy, representative government, leaders elected to office by a citizen body, that sort of thing. I think it's useful to make that sort of distinction because I don't think that we want to exclude our brothers and friends on the left from participating in this kind of exercise. So perhaps you could modify that one slide by taking that kind of distinction into consideration. Second question, very quickly, what kind of responses have you had to your study? I'm curious to hear about the range of responses that you've received so far. I would imagine it would be quite variable.
Let me respond to the first one first, and it really is Herbert Marcuse, who has liberation tolerance. That is a kind of, that says that basically given freedom, the oppressors will continue to oppress. And so liberation tolerance is basically, we need to put our thumb on the scale and change the rules depending on identity. That's the kind of socialism that creates problems.
Yes.
And I couldn't agree more with the positive characterization of the other. There's a wide range of responses to the survey. As some of you know, I was fired. I was found to be incompetent and professionally incompetent. And the notion that I had the scenarios had violated confidentiality, although there was no confidentiality required on the books, basically didn't matter. They've said both the president, the board, and a small group of faculty members who who met said I should no longer be a member, no longer have tenure, and no longer be a member of the faculty. So that started a long legal process that has another year or so to run. But there have been many positive comments as well about the survey and about the information and the results that we had. The effects on the students immediately were pretty negative, but I think in the long run, many of the students in that course have gone on to do outstanding, exceptional kinds of things. You have 3 of them here now, but there are many others. And actually, a lot of them are now interested in law school and, have offered to come back and help me out if the case is still running.
Thank you.
I think you're next.
I think I'm on the next, is that right?
Yes.
Okay, yes, thank you. Yes, thank you very much. I thought that was fascinating. It's I find it a bit dense in the sense of difficult material. And I just wanted to see if I understand a few things that you were putting forward. One is the more a person wants to have a protective environment, the more they're going to be sort of objecting to academic freedom protections. So that's one. I'm not sure is that correct?
That's an intriguing question, because if you ask people, is it important to have protection from hostile environments? And is it important to have academic freedom? People who answer yes to one are more likely to answer yes to the other. There's actually a positive correlation between how they answer that. However, if you give them some scenarios and say, put this in a category, is it a hostile environment or is it not a hostile environment? And then the next question is, would this be protected by academic freedom or would this not be protected? The people who are more likely to identify things as hostile environments are less likely to give any academic protection to it. So although in this case, the explicit, what people tell you that they support both of them, when we look at their actions and categorizing, it shows us something that is absolutely just the opposite. That once they see something as being a hostile environment, and it kind of relates to the one of the findings not too long ago that among American college students, some 40% think that there's a hate speech exemption in our First Amendment, freedom of speech, that you can have free speech as long as it's not hate speech. And sometimes hate speech gets defined as just about anything that upsets anyone else. There clearly is such things as hate speech, but often that gets extended. So that was a long answer to what I thought was a really short, clear, excellent question.
And so, okay, so that's very, very interesting. And it seems to me to be getting at that cognitive dissonance sort of problem, because everyone wants, especially if you're in the university, to be seen as supporting academic freedom. But some of the people I know very well who put forward arguments about how that we should have academic freedom are the worst totalitarians that I have, encountered. But there's something that I was, okay, so that's the first thing. The second thing is activism. Activism seems to be, so the more you're an activist or you see yourself as an activist, the more you're going to rub up against these be sort of suspicious of academic freedom according to that situation you're talking about, which is you give them the scenarios. But
we defined activism in this case by the responses to 2 questions. If somebody was speaking in a way that you expected to be offensive, would it be okay to shout them down? And would it be okay to physically block entrance so other people couldn't get to hear them? So that was our definition of activism.
Okay.
That predicted.
Obviously they have they don't really not in favor of the robust academic freedom certainly in the scenarios area. You mentioned gender, sexual orientation, and race. Is that correlated with this in any way? I'm not sure about that. So and then the final one, which is the thing that I'm actually the most confused about, I sort of missed it initially, what you were talking about, which was something about the more hostile the environment, the more academic freedom protections would come into existence. Something about that. There was some kind of linkage that was being made. I'm not sure if that was a hypothesis that was put forward, that like having hostile environments makes people recognize the need for academic freedom protections. Is that what was being said? I didn't quite understand that kind of that point was being made.
I'll start at the end and work backwards. George Orwell, who said, speech that offends nobody needs no protection.
Mhm.
The basic idea is that the more offensive speech is, the more likely it is to be challenged and punished, and the more likely it is to need academic freedom protection. So that was that last point. Berea College was the first college south of the Mason-Dixon line, which was the divide between North and South, to educate men and women, black and white, together. It was founded in 1855, even before the Civil War. There is a strong emphasis on interracial education. One of the spontaneous comments we got was from an African-American male who said, "I just wish my maleness was respected and recognized as much as my race." Race turned out not to be a factor in this limited study that we had. We only had 120 people, and the only categories were white, and we had a lot of other categories, but the numbers were too small. So the only analysis we could do was between those who identified as white and those who didn't. And it doesn't take much to realize that Asians and Hispanic students and African-American students all are very different. And so there wasn't any clear influence of race on any of the variables that we had. It just didn't come up. That certainly doesn't mean it's not a factor at your institution or at most other institutions, but at least for our sample at Berea College, race was not. Gender was, and sexual orientation was, political identity was, and a belief in activism. Those four variables, and all of those, if we look at it objectively, a scenario in order to, if an event happened, in order for it to be a hostile environment that we can actually take action against a person, we should have some kind of agreement. And if we don't have that agreement, we need to go back to school, go back to conversation, and come up with a sufficient understanding of what's going on and what the principles are, that we can identify objectively what these characteristics are, because the illusion of subjective sufficiency, that as long as somebody feels offended, it's enough to go find somebody to tar and feather, just makes no sense at all, and is incredibly counterproductive for the individuals and for the organization. Did that answer your questions?
Just so I have it correct, then, being homosexual and being a woman had some in the scenarios made them be somewhat suspicious of academic freedom in that scenario context.
Yes, yeah, and first it made them perceive, or it led to the perception that this is a hostile environment.
Mm.
You could follow the rationale. If it's a hostile environment,
yeah,
and academic freedom doesn't cover or doesn't protect somebody from creating hostile environments. And the difficulty with that is then what does it protect people from? If not saying something provocative that's likely to upset others.
Interesting. Thank you.
Before Phil, I think Christina's next.
Okay. Christina?
Yeah, thank you very much. That was really fascinating. I want to just briefly circle back to the microaggressions. I think there's a tendency, especially amongst people that defend academic freedom, to kind of brush those aside and say, well, it was really silly. But I do believe that we actually should take that seriously. And if people tell us again and again that they feel excluded, that they feel looked down upon and whatnot, we should take that seriously. The question, however, is what should we do about it? And I think what activists suggest is kind of there shouldn't be anyone ever exposed to a microaggression. And the moment that happens, the person needs to be penalized and that kind of stuff is also a form of microaggression, because it presupposes that the people on behalf of whom those activists speak cannot really defend themselves at all. And so I think that is actually really dangerous, to give the activists this kind of voice that they can speak on behalf of every single person of an oppressed group. Then there is a huge diversity within groups. And so, yes, some people obviously will need help and will need support. There's no doubt about that. But there are also people that are actually very strong on their own and can take care perfectly of themselves. So I have a lot of students of color that have no hard time whatsoever to tell me when they think I'm wrong or to speak up in my class. So we really should try to support that and give help to the others. And I wanted to commend, and again, I apologize for probably not getting the name right, Janine, for speaking up here, because I think it's probably really, really difficult to make a statement like that, especially in a group like ours, to say, yes, I feel that way. I feel, and a lot of African-American students feel that way. And I think we all should appreciate that she has the courage to do that. And that was just my piece.
Okay. Bill, then Yabsira?
Yeah, just comment. Well, first of all, a small comment. I strongly object to the use of the term all science is local. I think it's very misleading, but that's a minor point. The point I wanted was really out of my own experience. I remember when I took my undergraduate course in engineering in Australia back in 1955, that we attended a lecture from the Vice Chancellor, and he said, as we sat there and he introduced, he said, look to the left of you and look to the right of you. 1 out of 3 will graduate. And there was a sort of brutal truth in it that probably today would be found offensive. And what I guess I'm trying to get at is that, yes, there have been some improvements. For instance, as Churchill pointed out, that the law against homosexuality in England was a blackmailer's charter, for example. There's been a lot of improvements, but I also wonder whether there has been some negative developments associated with the way our society's evolved, gotten a bit too soft, if I can use such a crude phrase. Interesting comment. I don't know when anybody wants to react, but that's just an observation.
Yabsira?
So I want to just respond back to the question that Christina had, but I also want to say that Henry, then Boris, and Mark had questions. So I just wanted to be respectful of their hand raises in the question. But I think, Dave has a really good approach to recognizing the question of like microaggressions and like how do you deal with it, right? I think as a society, you have to have a base set of understandings and outcomes of where you want to go. If you're in the academic field, then the pursuit of knowledge and truth is the base understanding that everybody should have. And then that intention that other people are bringing should be expected. And then you should also expect the same. And fundamentally, not decrying somebody because of their viewpoint is where we really need to go. And Dave does a great job in his classroom where somebody can, come out of left field and ask a question that, some might find problematic. And then he just asks you, well, why do you think that? Or, ask another student to really respond to that question in the Socratic method. And that's where we really need to propose. And we really need to understand the base argument and the rules of engagement. Because, the issue we have around challenges to academic freedom and all these hostile protections that are happening is the lack of earnesty and sincerity in making progress and changes. If you're wrong in a specific topic, you have to be able to admit that you're wrong. But that doesn't mean that you're wrong about your whole identity or dissertation or whatnot. It's okay, and it's understood that we could all make mistakes. The important thing is that in that area, we have to have that earnesty, sincerity, and the willingness and courage to say I'm wrong, to say you're wrong, and pursue knowledge and truth in that endeavor.
Can I say something real quick, about what Yabsira said and with the microaggression too? Christina said about how people were saying her English was really good, and that was a compliment. When I first came here, I also got that a lot. Your English is really good, because it's my second language. But the funny thing is, I didn't find it to be a microaggression. I was genuinely happy when people were telling me that, until I was told by other people oh, hey, that's a microaggression. But before that, I was just very happy to be receiving that compliment. So I think the microaggression thing is also a double-sided sword. Who gets to decide what is microaggression to who? And everyone is different. If one person might be insulted, the other person might not be. And another thing is, I felt because of all this microaggression talk, a lot of people are afraid to approach, I just want to be friends with everyone. It's I don't want you to be afraid of me. I want to get to know you. And not everyone will think that what you say is probably bad. I just want to say that real quick.
Thank you, Jen. Henry, did you have a comment?
Yeah, it was I guess it was just maybe echoing what Phil said about the microaggressions. So I think one of the basic oldest rules is to do no harm, in quotes. And maybe there's lots of things wrong with microaggressions. Somebody goes and insults somebody and hurts them. Obviously, I think that's wrong. But if we go and make some drastic changes, then we don't know what harm we're doing. And as well, maybe some people who are afraid to speak up, if we help them speak up, they will never learn to speak up on their own. They'll only be able to speak up when we help them. The only way they will learn to speak up is if they did learn on their own. So I think we have to be, I think, in my opinion, it's dangerous to make some very serious rule changes and have universities make rules about what microaggressions are and start, well, that's what I wanted to say.
Okay, I guess the one thing in those comments, though, is there are an awful lot of things that I've learned in the last 72 years that I never would have learned on my own. And I'm eternally grateful for the structure and support and the advantages and opportunities that I've had. And I think recognizing that not everybody has had those same opportunities, and trying to create a system that's open and encouraging and supports everybody is a goal that's worth pursuing. Gail?
Before Gail,
Yes.
Paul is next. I'm so sorry.
Yabsira.
Paul is next.
Oh, Gail?
Oh, I heard that Paul was next.
Okay. Paul,
Paul, are you there?
I think we may have lost Paul. Gail?
Okay, well, I'd like to thank
Paul
Janai
is
and Jen for both of their comments. Like after Janai talked, I was starting to feel bad that I shouldn't compliment any of my students because I don't know if they might take it badly. And then after Jen spoke, then I felt, okay, then I guess I can. And then it's confusing because you don't now, like after Jen spoke, Janai spoke, I thought, gee, I have to be really careful what I say to my students. Like I never usually, if someone does something good, I say, that was really good. And maybe they're going to think I'm belittling them when there's no intention.
No, I think that the thing is that me and Jen's experiences are different. And that is something that you would have to take into context. Her learning English is different from my experience being an American born, I am from the US, but people still belittle me as if I can't speak. What I'm speaking about in terms of me speaking coherently and eloquently and how she speaks is totally different. Me expressing a complete thought can be surprising to a white person, but
maybe that's true, but maybe you do speak especially eloquently, even compared to white people. And that is what they are trying to say. And maybe you are taking an insult where a compliment is actually deserved.
And that's the thing. I think the problem is that people just want to be able to show up as themselves and be able to speak intelligently without it being noticed, because it's being noticed because I am a person of color.
Are you sure? Are you sure it's because you're a person of color?
If I notice that there is a white person in the classroom that they speak just as intelligently as, let's say we both speak at the same level, but the teacher never says anything to them, but comes to me and says something to me specifically. What is the difference?
You think that they're doing that to belittle you?
At the end of the day, you're not going to understand, Gail, because you don't have my lived experiences. And that's the problem. We have a lot of people who are coming from a place of privilege, who are white and who do have a privileged point in society, gaslighting people of color and telling them, you can't be experiencing this. This is not real for you.
But there's other things. For example, we keep getting told that people of color, well, I'm not so sure well, I guess you are in the United States, have underprivileged, you don't have as good education, you don't have, the opportunities, etc. So then maybe, again, you're being complimented because people think that you have had to, even though you're born in the United States and lived there all your life, you have had to go through certain adversities that white people haven't. And maybe then, again, maybe their intention is not to belittle you, it's to compliment you.
My thing is, I'm not saying that everybody's intention is to belittle me. I think the whole purpose of this research is to show that people have different experiences. I know I can tell the difference personally when someone is trying to compliment me and when somebody is being condescending and being rude towards me, because I have lived through the experience of people telling me that as a compliment and people telling me that to degrade me. So
I can understand that then.
Okay, let me offer one brief story and an example of that. I had a colleague who was at times would compliment and say, boy, that student is just so articulate, in making that point. And after we had known each other a couple of years, I pointed out to him that word articulate was something that he only used with African-American students. He never said that about anybody else. And so it was, a pattern that he undertook that I don't think he was aware of, that he intended, but it revealed his surprise and the expectation that they wouldn't be articulate.
That
or
they're inarticulate, exactly. It's not me saying that like, oh, these people are just, you know, trying to be a certain way towards me. But I think that when you're in a place of disadvantage, you notice the differences in how people treat you and how they treat other people. I notice when my teacher expects me to be ignorant, but you know, that's not something that they expect of their white students. You know, they expect them to be able to articulate themselves and be able to express a complete thought. But if I raise my hand and I, you know, express things in the same way, or even if I talk a certain way, like for instance, they expect us to talk, you know, like we're stupid, like we don't have education.
Because Gail mentioned that she's confused if she should compliment her students or not after I spoke. I just want to say that that's the point, that what I'm trying to make. People get confused. Some people are going to take it as an insult. Some people are going to take it as a compliment. And then people come in, like when they try to interact with me, especially in a college education, right? In a college setting. And they don't know how to act because they were so scared that everything that they're saying is going to take it as an insult. So that was like the point, I think, is that no one knows how to act anymore in this.
You know, I think Dave's statement about education, I think the most profound form of disrespect is lowering expectations is a good way to approach that situation, Gail. So I think in that instance, like the measuring stick you should have is, do they speak at a normal level that you'd have for anybody? And do they exceed that? Then you should articulate your understanding or, you know, like praise in that manner. But to, you know, regardless of what anybody says or whatever realities people had, to lower your expectations because of your expectations of them is the area where people might find condescending. So I would say, you know, as Dave said, you know, lowering expectations is the most profound level of disrespect. So don't do that.
Okay, let's get to some of the other questions. Brooks? Need to unmute.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Good, okay. Yeah, on this question of microaggression, it's, you know, I haven't heard a conversation as profound as this about it, just out of my experience. You know, I understand microaggression or aggression in some sense. I grew up as a kid as a Newfoundlander, and you know, there were hundreds of books around the country telling the same joke about how many Newfoundlanders it took to screw in a light bulb, you know, 1 to hold the light bulb and 3 to turn the ladder, etc., which was told about Polish people and so on down the line. But I think probably what troubles me the most is, you know, people only have the power to sort of hurt you emotionally if you give it to them. And what worries me about the whole microaggression notion is that the person who perceives, you know, you're going to get offenses all through life. I mean, people will give offense intentionally, people will give offense accidentally, but you have to take offense to allow it to really bother you. And I'm not sure that, you know, I hear a lot of talk about unfairness and fairness and et cetera that have been brought up, but I guess the only advice you give to individuals is that, you know, if you allow yourself to go through life taking offense at something that we're calling micro, which to my best understanding is micro, it almost sounds like an oxymoron. You know, it's like if something is so microscopic that it has to be described as micro, it's very impossible. It's very possible that it is so small that that you shouldn't allow it to hurt you.
If you look in the comments, you'll see that I made the comment that micro and macro exist together. The micro is a component of the macro. So there is a reason why there is a concept of microaggressions, because there are macroaggressions, such as people being killed by a police officer, the prison pipeline for African-American people. If you could go to any city in the US, who are going to be the homeless people the most? African-Americans. So it's not just this micro situation where people are trying to put up a glass and see, oh, where is this person being racist? It's a reality. And I don't think that you will understand unless you want to take the position of being African-American. Would you want to be African-American? Ask yourself that question. Probably not, because you wouldn't want to have to go through any of the things that African-Americans go through. So you're not going to understand. You're going to think that people are just, complaining and, making things up and holding up that's not the reality. The micro is a component of the macro.
Yeah, I think the macro is a context that identity does play and provide special opportunities for some people to see things the rest of us don't. And it's an opportunity to learn, to have a conversation. And it really depends on the nature of the relationships that we create. I want to move on and make sure we get the questions, Paul, and then Mark will let you close. Paul? Paul, can you speak up?
Paul, are you there?
I think he must be long gone.
No.
Can you hear me now?
He just unmuted, so he should be there.
Yeah. Paul?
Yeah, I'm trying to adjust my microphone. It seems to be failing me. Can you hear me now okay?
Yes, that's better.
Okay.
Maybe it's best to go to Mark. I don't know if Paul's speaking.
Yeah. Okay, Mark, you're on.
Hi, Dave. You can hear me?
Yes.
Yes, good. I want to know a bit more about hostile environment, according to the people you interviewed. Now, first of all, I take it it's possible for one to identify an environment as hostile and yet at the same time think that academic freedom protections, so that was built into your survey. If you identify the environment as hostile and yet you think that academic freedom protections are salient there, you would opt for some other way of dealing with the hostility you perceive in the environment than filing an official complaint or something like that, right? Is that the idea? Yeah. Okay, now
let me explain a little bit about hostile environments, because it is a matter of law. It's a matter of the 1964 Civil Rights Act that said discrimination. There are really two kinds of discrimination in the workplace. One is quid pro quo, this for that, basically asking for sexual favors in exchange for a promotion or a good assignment. And Title IX extended those definitions to all colleges and universities. So again, quid pro quo, which everybody realizes is a kind of sexual discrimination that is clearly incompatible with our principles. But hostile environment is if the environment becomes so hostile that the person can't participate in what's in the educational enterprise. Then you've discriminated against the individual, and the institution is responsible for stopping it or changing it. Now, fortunately, the institution may think that the way to stop it or change it is by punishing the person who maybe even inadvertently or unintentionally created the hostile environment. I think that's pretty silly and pretty counterproductive. I think it's important to recognize that some hostile environments do exist. They can interfere with some individuals' opportunity to participate fully in education. And there are things that we can do to educate one another, to basically eradicate them and allow people to participate more fully in the educational process. So I think the idea of hostile environments is a good one. The idea of punishing people who may have inadvertently created them is the problem.
Well, there are two locations that I want to ask you about. One is the institution. The institution itself would have some account of what sorts of behaviors could create a hostile environment. But then the people you interviewed, the respondents to your survey, would have their views about what sorts of behaviors would potentially create a hostile environment. Was there a difference between the two? Is the institution, do they have a more expansive account of the sorts of behaviors that could produce a hostile environment than the people who were surveyed, or was it the other way around? Or do they think that the same, both the institution and the people surveyed think the same sorts of behaviors can create hostile environments?
I think that's a wonderful question, and I don't have a good answer to it. We were at the point of just collecting things that had happened and then asking the question of how would people characterize these. In looking at those scenarios, I was hard pressed to come up with objective rules to say, these are the kind of scenarios that would be classified as hostile environments, and these are the kinds that would not. It didn't seem to follow a very logical, it didn't lend itself to any kind of objective or logical analysis, which I think means we're in trouble when we try to apply this notion, especially in education. In the workplace, where Title VII was initially intended, I think it's a little more clear when somebody is intentionally, if somebody asks you a question that's unsettling. In an educational environment, it may be because they don't like you and they're picking on you. On the other hand, it may be to get you to think and to get you to look at it from a different perspective. So there are both legitimate and illegitimate reasons for, for lack of a better word, provoking somebody. In the workplace, I think there are a lot fewer reasons to provoke somebody. And so most of the actions that in an educational environment might be seen as being academically appropriate wouldn't be appropriate in something other than an academic setting.
Yes, I agree with you about that. On the other hand, I would rather that society was more like a good university than that good universities were more like high schools, or that high schools were more like universities than universities were like high school. But just one more comment following on that matter. I would take it that in an educational environment, and perhaps not in other workplaces or recreational environments, that speaking an opinion on the matter at hand in the classroom or around the table or at a talk, whatever, speaking an opinion, no matter what that opinion is, could not create an actionable hostile environment. That the opinion can, in these contexts, be debated, addressed in the student newspaper, perhaps discussed, maybe not in the classroom itself. Now, did respondents to your survey, did they hold that the expressing of an opinion could turn a classroom environment, a talk by a visiting speaker, a discussion after a movie into a hostile environment. Suppose the topic is parenting styles, and you know that the person next to you was parented in a particular way, but you object to that way, and you raise this in the discussion. That might well make people uncomfortable, but it's a thesis on the table that we're there to discuss. But did people in your survey, were there many who would take expressing an opinion in such a context potentially to create a hostile environment?
This was a quantitative rather than a qualitative survey. And one of the distinctions to be made there is basically we limited people to 6 choices between strongly agree and strongly disagree. We didn't ask for narratives or essays or any kind of account or example.
But you gave scenarios.
Yeah, we gave them the scenarios, but we defined the scenarios ahead of time and asked them to either agree or disagree that they were hostile environments. And I'm not sure there was a single question that we didn't have every one of the 6 choices covered.
Yeah. Well, I'm just wondering, was there a scenario in which someone offered an opinion, an opinion that may have been offensive to many people? So in the scenario, he offers an opinion, say, about parenting styles, or whatever, and the respondents thought, oh, this was a case of a hostile environment.
Yeah, here's one that actually happened to me in my class. I taught a course in an introduction to behavioral science. And in that, we talked about evolution. And I had 2 fundamentalist students who were quite offended that, my views on evolution and the views of on which really all of the science and behavioral science is based were antithetical to their beliefs. And because this was a science class and not a religion class or a humanities class, I expected them to accept that. And in the scenario, it said they filed a Title IX complaint.
I see.
Not actually what they did. They just waited till the end of the course and gave me 0 ratings and said I was a bigot. So there are different ways for them to exercise some power. But there were people who agreed that was a hostile environment. And, that's where I think to know where our challenges are, that there are people who are going to view any kind of challenge as hostility. And that's unfortunate because we can't educate unless we can challenge. I don't think.
Dave, are there other questions? I think we're way past time. So I'd like to thank you on behalf of the Society for Academic Freedom and Scholarship and the students you brought with you for a very interesting and thought-provoking session tonight.
This truly was the most fun I've had since I wrote the survey. But I appreciate your questions, and you have my email. I'd be glad to correspond with any of you or provide any additional information. You've been a wonderful audience, great questions, and I can't tell you how proud I am of these students. And you can see that that education brings out the best in all of us, and in bringing out and strengthening our students, it really strengthens us too. So thank you.
Right. Thanks, everyone. Good night.
Thanks a lot. Thank you very much to the students. I don't want to be offensive, I realize, but I think that's amazing to have students that show up and just articulate their positions honestly and without fear I think that's fantastic. And it's probably, it says something about the educational process. Thank you very much.